We're already 7 years down the track working between Janus and Ikon. That's quite a substantial period already, and I think it's a testimony to yourselves in particular, in that you've created a business and a product and a niche that is gaining in its sustainability and its appeal. Mm-hmm. And that's really good, to get to 7 years.
Welcome to the Janus Motorcycles podcast. Our kind of motorcycling is different from what you see from big brands and big bikes. We manufacture classic, simple, small displacement motorcycles because that's what we like to ride. And we're not alone. On this podcast, we talk with some of the smartest and most interesting people we know in motorcycling, design, and manufacturing. We're glad you're here. Geoff Lowe is owner and managing director of Proven Products, an Australian company established in 1962 in Sydney, Australia, which specializes in providing shock absorbers and springs to wholesale, retail, and trade customers worldwide for cars, motorcycles, trucks, buses, motorsport, and a variety of special applications. Proven Products was originally established by Geoff's father, Lance Lowe, and a friend to exclusively import, distribute, and service Koni shock absorbers. Lance and his wife, Naomi, handled the day-to-day operations, with the business in the early years being run out of the Guildford, Australia home of the Lowe family. Shock absorbers, as they were imported, were stored in the house in its garage. Additions were made to the house to become a more workable office area and accommodate the new staff. Inevitably, Geoff grew up around cars, motorcycles, and Koni shock absorbers, and began to work in the business in the late 70s after school. He studied business and mechanical subjects, also undergoing specialized training at the Koni factory in the early 80s. In 2000, Koni decided to close its production of motorcycle shock absorbers, which it began in the late 60s. This decision led to a special license agreement between Proven Products and Koni, allowing them to make the motorcycle shocks under its own name for the worldwide market. Today, Geoff and his wife, Louise, own and run the business, which is located in Albury, New South Wales. And for us over here, we don't know anything about it. That's about halfway between Sydney and Brisbane. The current Ikon range, or Melbourne, sorry, there we go. So Sydney and Melbourne. I don't know Australia either. The current Ikon, Melbourne's north, isn't it?
No, Melbourne's south.
Even further, Brisbane's north.
Brisbane is north, yeah.
The current Ikon range consists of a growing variety of shock absorbers and springs for rear suspensions, or front in the case of Janus, and fork springs for the front end. Janus has been using Ikon shock absorbers from the launch of our 250 line and leading link front suspension back in 2015. It's been a pleasure working with Geoff over the years, and I very much look forward to this conversation. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you, Richard. Nice introduction. And we'll sort out the locations, and most importantly, so long as the freight companies know how to get things from where we are to where you are, life goes on.
Exactly. You can please, as you already have, make some corrections as I go along. But
the evolution of the business is such, though, at the moment, and this, I guess, the let's call it a transition as much as an evolution, ended, I guess, in between when we saw you last and now, and it was already on track for this before that. In that, in reality, the business as it is now in 2022 is really 100% motorcycle focused. While we still know what a car looks like and those sorts of things, we don't really do anything of note in suspension other than the motorcycle market these days. And I'd say the way COVID has unfolded, I've been very pleased that that's the case, because some of the challenges in supply chains and logistics and all this sort of stuff that I'm sure we've all been seeing around the world have, been complicated enough without being in more than just motorcycles.
Absolutely. We know all about that. Especially shipping products literally halfway around the world back and forth. It's wild.
It is. But it's really quite surprising to think, really, that we're already 7 years down the track in working between Janus and Ikon. That's quite a substantial period already, and I think it's a testimony to yourselves in particular, in that you've created a business and a product and a niche that is gaining in its sustainability and its appeal. Mm-hmm. And that's really good, to get to 7 years. is quite an achievement.
In the new motorcycle world, that it really is.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's fun to be having this conversation now, because when we first got started, and really, I want to say that, like, with the launch of the 250, which was when I started talking to you really before we launched that, about speccing these out. That was really when we started manufacturing. Prior to that, we had our 50cc, but that really was sort of a one-off. One bike funded the next, two or three guys in a garage, essentially. And then after that, we really started marketing them and entering production. So that was one of my first contacts with a supplier in that, or you were, and it's just been fun to. I remember. I've always enjoyed the interactions we've had, and that's part of a really successful. That's like the good side of manufacturing and supply chain for me.
Let's be assured that feeling is mutual, and that's it's nice to have that sort of thing going on, because then it's more than just a simple transaction. And I always and I enjoy following what Janus is doing on social media or elsewhere. And I'm not heavily engaged in those things, so I'm just too busy in that anyways. Yeah. But I like to see it. It's really great, and it's unique, it's special, and that's part of our relationship. Yeah.
So we've managed over the years to, at least on 2 occasions, run into each other at motorcycle events and trade. And Geoff's seen our bikes in person, et cetera. So anyway, can you tell us a little bit more, without all the details, but I just wanted a little bit more what I missed about the history of Ikon suspension. Anything you have to add there?
That was really quite a concise history of everything that goes back to the beginning till present day. Only with that final pointer, really, that all of those things that had more wheels than motorcycles have, so that sort of limits us to 3 wheels, right? Really are no longer a part of the business in the way they were back in the 60s. Obviously, the Coney range added the motorcycle things in 1967. So the first 5 years of the operations didn't actually have motorcycles at all. Yeah. That came in, a little bit along the way, but clearly it has become ultimately who and what we are. It's what we, live, think, breathe when it comes to the proven products Ikon suspension business. Anything else is just not so much there anymore, and not really something we're even seeking to do. We're more than satisfied with continuing to work with and develop things that work with motorcycle suspension, and in particular in the niches and genres that we tend to focus on, which of course is heavily informed by our Coney history.
Yeah, so right there, that's exactly a good segue. Tell people listening to this a little bit who don't know more about Coney and the history there.
Well, okay, they launched their motorcycle range in the late 1960s, then 1967.
But they were a brand that had already been around and it had established Coney, by that point.
That's right. Coney's history goes back to horse and cart days in reality. Mm-hmm. But the shock absorber part of the business started in the latter part of the Second World War in 1944. So it continues from then until now. In 1972, the de Koning family sold the business to ITT. So they're actually an American-owned organisation these days.
Originally part of Dutch? Where were they from originally?
Dutch, yes, they're Dutch. That's right. And the name Coney comes from the family name of the business, de Koning.
Right.
But simply being the Dutch word for king. So as in König, if you were German, for example.
Yep.
So the shock absorber world is what they became. There was a few other things they continued with, even doing some hoists for cars and things like this. Okay. And they sold that off into a British company called Sturthill at some point along the way. But Coney's activities embraced not just motorcycles, but cars, trucks, rail, and infrastructure like buildings and bridges that have shock absorbers and so on.
Yeah.
And dare I say, the motorcycle part of the business always was, and a reflection of the suspension market generally, a small, more or less blip on their radar.
Yep.
And so for whatever reasons, which they never really exposed to me, their choice to no longer continue with that didn't really make a great deal of difference to the Coney business, because it was a minority of the activity. And obviously over time, there'd been other parts, like the hoists, for example, that they had removed from their activity. So it wasn't an unusual thing for them to rationalise their activities in that way. It was just that clearly we chose to get involved and change ourselves from just being an importer distributor working in a single market, being the Australian market, to a manufacturer and exporter to whoever is interested in the product.
Little tiny companies in Indiana.
Was not to like.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned earlier that there were certain market segments that you're not only focusing on motorcycles, but you all are more. There are areas even within that category that you focus on. One of the reasons I found you all is that you all were one of the first things that I found about that specialized in traditional like twin shocks for the back, for the rear end.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that and what the difference is.
All right. So the Coney business, with limited exception, was very much a twin shock focused shock absorber contribution to motorcycles. So that really meant that the market over time, as they were looking at it, let's take our lenses back to, let's say, 1998, 1999. There were not really a lot of motorcycle manufacturers still providing shock absorbers in what I'll call the Western marketplace with two shock absorbers on them. So when we say twin shocks, we mean like twin shocks, old-fashioned on the back. Correct, that's right. See them. And even at one stage, some of the language we used to use around that would even throw the word stereo shock absorbers on there instead of mono shock absorbers. Oh, right, yeah. And that was in fact, Coney's own language at the time was included that, so it wasn't something we created for ourselves. And this is, again, most bikes by the mid 80s, going into the 90s, we're shifting from this dirt bike technology of single shock, mono shock. Yep, that's right. Bearing in mind, and people that are as old as me, that's why I have this grey hair stuff happening. Oh, I got that too. Yeah, it's popular. It really is. It catches. I get cheeky with people because most people don't know their motorcycle history, and I'm by no means an aficionado or expert in motorcycle history either, really. But some things stand out to me, and I don't mind having a bit of fun with people in conversation. And I will very quickly draw the line on monoshocks back to old motorbikes, German NSUs, for example. Some of those had a single shock on them. And most notably, probably the best known anywhere in the world, is the Vincent, which used a single shock system from the 1940s. So the fact that in the late 1970s, dirt bikes started to appear with monoshocks was yet again another reinvention of the wheel. And okay, why is that important, and why is that interesting, other than just being historically controversial or provocative, perhaps? Well, the same sort of thing happened again in the year 2000 in motorcycles. Now, twin shocks never went away. They never did. And in the US, you guys continue to see more twin shocks than any other marketplace anywhere in the world. Probably second only to maybe Italy in motorcycles. Because of like Harley or something? Exactly right. That's exactly the reason. Now, Italy saw it because of Moto Guzzi. Yep. So with Guzzi continuing to make twin shock bikes as well across that time, other than that, let's call it the last man standing in the twin shock world, then arguably and I say Western motorcycles. So I'm not picking on some of the others that were out there that they were never really the Coney market. They're still not our market today, some of those sort of things. But BMW would have been the other last man standing, because by then Triumph had sort of vanished altogether in the early 1980s.
Right.
But in 1984 was when the famous R series BMWs were replaced by the K series bikes.
Yes.
And then later on, 84, 85, also a new range of R series single-sided swing arm bikes came out. And that took BMW out of the twin shock marketplace into monoshocks as well.
Mm-hmm.
So where were twin shocks still to be found? Well, okay, yeah, you could enter the scooter market, which Coney were never really into.
Yep.
That's never left, and the twin shock marketplace.
Yep.
But other than that, the biggest twin shock Western world market product would have been Harley, as you said. And so in those days, possibly still the case, I'm not up to date on the data, but certainly running through the 2000s still, the largest volume selling Harleys were the baggers, Road Kings, those sorts of bikes, street glides, road glides, and they all had two shocks on them. Mm-hmm. And given that my understanding is that in the US of road going bikes, just over 50% of the market is consumed by Harley, and 50% of that 50% was the Road Kings.
Yeah.
And of course, across those years, the Sportsters and Dyners, FXRs, those things, they also had two shocks on them.
Mm-hmm.
So there was the largest, most dominant thing going on with two shocks in motorcycles.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened in 2000? Well, the world of motor cars had already seen this retro styling thing come along, and you saw Chrysler do things like the PT Cruiser, for instance.
Boy, you're talking my language here. This is very interesting.
So the world of retro had suddenly emerged. And then Triumph, who had been on a comeback path already through the 1990s,
yep,
they introduced the Bonneville.
Yeah.
Okay. So other than that, you had Harley, you had the Kawasaki W650.
Yeah, that's an old, but a very retro design.
Right. It was Kawasaki's answer to, Triumph aren't here anymore. We'll make a Triumph.
And people have said it's more Triumph than some of the Triumphs.
Yeah, well, but it didn't leak.
Nope. Yeah, it didn't leak, exactly.
So not enough British in there. But anyway, so Triumph introduced this thing called the Bonneville. So then you've got Guzzi is still doing two shocks, Harley is still doing them, what have you. But then Triumph hit the marketplace, and that really set the world on fire because the retro thing took off in the motorcycle world. Another thing that happened in those early 2000s as well, which was significant for us and has helped to build a restoration marketplace, which connected with the retro thing, Japanese laws changed. And the motorbikes of the 1970s that were so popular in the West, so just to stick with Kawasaki, so take the Z900s, for instance, the Z1000, Z1s, or it was Honda's CB750, the CB900s, this sort of stuff, and others. They were motorcycles that the Japanese home market never, ever saw because they were not legal on Japanese roads because of engine capacity rules.
They're too big.
So they were all export market motorcycles. The rules changed. And so there was this whole, what should I call them? Just call it a group of people, enthusiasts, who decided, well, okay, we can ride these bikes of ours on our roads now that we could never ride before. I'm sort of putting words in their mouth to create the story, but this is what happened. So they literally went around the world, to the United States, Australia, elsewhere. They found, barn finds or wherever they found them, and they imported Japanese bikes, wrecks largely, from all over the world into Japan and restored them. And they still do to some extent.
Yep.
But this also added an enthusiasm to this retro marketplace but in bike restoration. It created demand for parts, not just shock absorbers, which had, to all intents and purposes, gone off the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I sit here today, we sometimes joke to ourselves without even knowing the numbers, because we just don't. We think, for example, that we probably made as many shock absorbers in the last 20 years for Kawasaki Z900s as they ever made Z900s, and probably some more. Because it just keeps on going.
That's amazing.
So what this did to us as a business, this fed demand back into that tradition, both in bike restoration and new bikes. And then it wasn't just Triumph. Harley, of course, have kept doing what they're doing. They only actually changed away from the twin shock marketplace to any significance with the range that ran beside them in Buell.
Yeah.
And nowadays, in the merger of the Softail and Dyna that has a mono shock on it. Everything else, whether it was Sportsters, the streets that they made, and I think have now discontinued globally, they had two shocks on them. The baggers still have two shocks on them. So that still continues.
And even their, I don't know my Harley terminology, but like their Softail versions that have like a concealed suspension, that's a paired set, I believe, isn't
Originally,
it?
Up until 2017, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And two of the hardest working shock absorbers, in my opinion, in the world of suspension, bar nothing. Even harder than you'd find on a Kenworth or something.
Wow.
Because they lay horizontally and they work backwards on a very short stroke and very high pressures and very high spring rates. Very, very demanding, very demanding. But so that was also two shocks. But from 2017, that changed. And the Dyna range and the Softail range were merged, whole new design, lots of changes, including moving to a single shock setup. But so Triumph came along in 2000 and did those things, and it really changed. It changed the world of motorcycle suspension, and brought back to the eyes of the marketplace a design that had been abandoned for, let's say, 15 to 16 years in terms of volume manufacture and distribution in the Western world, and was gradually continuing to fade in the eyes of the market. And you would probably argue that if that had continued, you get to 20 or 25 years down the track, and there may not have been any twin shock models to talk about. But then Guzzi, not to be outdone, introduced the Breva 650, which was a twin shock model that eventually morphed into the V7s, which they've had several iterations now. And of course, there's the V9 series they brought out, and their Californias and so on also remain that way. And the Eldorados, that sort of stuff in the bigger bikes, as well as in Guzzi's case, having a range of monoshock models in their sport bike series. But as a small player in the marketplace, and with the history that we had coming from Coney, well, that just fell nicely into our way of doing things.
Right.
And so therefore, having a classic product to maintain the classic nature of something and even engage with a marketplace that again had that retro, or what had now become retro and classic look, was just right up our alley, and still is.
Right. That's really interesting. And that was happening, you're saying, in the late 90s, early 2000s?
Okay, yes. If we wind back, as I said, to 1998 or so, because that was, that really is the end of Coney's development of things. And when they made their decision about not being in the marketplace for whatever reasons they made it, they nor I would have had any inkling that here comes this thing called Triumph that's going to, let's say, reinvent the wheel in terms of volume motorcycles on the roads out there. That hadn't happened yet, and nor had happened the changes in the Japanese rules that allowed for these bikes that were so popular in our markets, so the US, Australia, Western Europe, to suddenly be ridden on Japanese roads. And they've obviously done it en masse over there. That wouldn't have been in Koni's eyes. They just wouldn't have seen that. I don't think anybody would have seen that coming. It would have been a development project within the four walls of Triumph, kept probably very tightly until it was time to make it emerge, by which time it fell to us to make shock absorbers for that, in terms of that history.
So at this point, you were moving from stocking, distributing, receiving, shipping these things all over the world to now you're thinking about making them. So this is a pretty big shift.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've been simply importing. That's right. So Koni announced to us early on in 2000, I couldn't give you an exact date, but within the first quarter, say, of 2000, that essentially they were pulling out. So it was at the beginning part, the first quarter of 2000, that those discussions started, because clearly, I'll say, getting no answers, and that's fine. I'm not aggrieved about that. I'd be foolish to be aggrieved about it now, even if I was then. They didn't give any great explanation as to, well, why are we doing this? It was just basically an announcement.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, okay, that's not really what I'd like to see happen. What are the chances of rethinking this? Well, there were none. So I said, okay, well, if we're not going to rethink this, we as an organisation have a passion for this product and what it offers, even in the market as it was then, where the Bonneville hasn't yet.
You didn't know the Bonneville was going to hit. You didn't know that this stuff was going to happen.
Had no clue. Wasn't even there. So we were happy to say, well, okay, let's do a deal and take that over. Now, okay, cut the long story short, because there are many more twists and turns in between.
Sure.
But in the end, that's what happened, exactly as you had detailed in the introduction. We arrived at an exclusive global licensing agreement with Koni to take over the manufacture of that product range, with the responsibility for doing so being 100% ours. And so that's precisely what happened. And by the end of 2000, early 2001, we clearly had then changed from being an importer of that product to the first shock absorbers being made in our facility in Albury coming into existence, at which point we could then say to the world, well, okay, we are now here and we're happy to provide products for all of these motorbikes, just like they used to be provided, on exactly the same specification basis. Then, of course, develop into the future. Some of that future development, obviously, with the things we've been talking about with Triumph and others, Guzzi models and other twin shock models that have come along. There have been quite a number of them. They aren't the only ones, but we don't need to catalogue all that now.
Yep.
And then, of course, other super exciting opportunities, such as when, yes, you came along 7+ years ago now. And we started that conversation. And ironically, we were introduced to each other, to our now retired dealer in San Francisco, who was a BMW specialist.
Is that Roger?
Chap by the name of David Gardner.
Oh, David
you
Gardner.
Tracked him down, and Dave said, well, Richard, you don't need to talk to me. You need to talk to Geoff. Geoff, meet Richard. Here we go.
There we go. Absolutely. That's really interesting. And what about like the custom bike revival, like Bike XC, like Australia? I mean, it's sort of a center for that. You have cafe racers. There's a couple of different major websites that curate custom builds, and that's an Australian thing. And that's also, does that tie into this?
Well, of course it does, because the custom build world, has focused on a few things, one of which is older bikes, cafe racing. So getting hold of, let's say, old Ducatis or something like this and doing stuff to it. The W650 Kawasaki has been popular, very, very popular. The SR Hondas, the SR Yamahas, SR400, SR500, very popular bike to do that sort of thing with. And they were one of the minority bikes in the Western world market that continued to have two shocks on them. And
R series BMWs.
Sorry?
All these R series BMWs are
yes,
perpetual
definitely.
favorite.
Yes, And they've taken on their profile, as we've seen anyway, for some years was very much more restoration, more so than customization. But in more recent years, a lot more customization has crept into the Rs as well, whether it be the R65s or the R90s, R100s, all those sort of things. It absolutely has. But there are a number of companies down here, one of which, of course, has a global presence in actual fact, being Deus Ex Machina.
Oh, Deus Ex Machina, yep.
Places in the US as well as Italy and Australia. And then, of course, out of England, there's the famous Ace Cafe and things that they've done. So there's quite a global movement in that. And one way or another, we've always been around that kind of thing.
I'm thinking especially of I always forget how to pronounce it, but Bike XF, the website that curates, like that's also Australian, or originally, what's his name? That runs that. It's now owned by Aaron and Air, but that's an Australian thing. And I just thought I'd throw that in there because it does seem like there's more people looking at it and are fascinated by these older bikes, which just happen to all be twin shock, or at least the vast majority of them. So,
and as I said, that played very nicely into our business, all those years ago, 20 plus years ago now, 22, 23 years ago, as this was emerging. It breathed life right back into that kind of marketplace, which, no doubt about it, up until then, that market was in decline one way or another. It wasn't going to continue with new models in the way that it ultimately has. And I think it's a great thing because it's given the motorcycle industry and the motorcycle world a diversity of appearance that has made it a much nicer thing to look at. Obviously, I have a bias, but
me too.
When you look at so many of the other bikes out there, change the badge, they're still very same to look at.
Absolutely, and I feel like if you look at the time frame around, I really feel like we're talking about BMWs, and I was just looking through, talking about this retro concept, and the R90, the R100S, I really think that was the end of a certain kind of BMW, and it was also that also lines up with a lot of other manufacturers. That's when right about then is when monoshock suspension starts. I'm not saying they're connected. I'm not saying one caused the other, but it also was when, in my mind, you get these plastic clad, more and more boring bikes. Like the Suzuki Katana the original is an amazing bike, but then it very quickly gets derailed into this world of where it's a Ninja, and it doesn't look like anything, and everything looked the same. So I don't know. I'm just kind of, it's interesting that those two line up to me.
That's right. Yeah, and of course, in terms of Western world markets, the last event that's happened, and I'm sure there'll be more events like this because BSA are coming back with stuff now. So I think there's more to be told on this retro story. In other words, is the re-entry of Royal Enfield into Western markets. Of course, they never went away from India, which became their backyard. But the fact that they've now re-emerged globally with a whole range of models, very much styled after the same retro twin shock thing, which of course is what they've been making for over 100 years anyways. That kind of marketplace has only been added to by their presence.
It's very interesting. So we talked about a little bit about moving toward manufacturing. I'll move on a little bit. Tell us about what is the typical, what is the manufacturing cycle of a shock absorber look like? What is it? What does it look like from raw material to a finished delivered product?
Okay, so the end result for us is typically focused on the product when it is completed, having either chrome or black type finishes. But the things that are underneath that skin are all going to be identical. It's only a matter of which of those skins have you put over it. Did you put a black skin, a chrome skin, or a mixture over it? For example, the shocks we currently make for yourselves, on the front end of the leading link there, it's a mixture of the chrome and the black. So, but underneath that, obviously there are, at the shock absorber level, keeping the spring aside from the shock absorber for this time, there's the steels and plastics and oils and rubbers that go into making up all of those things. The processes of, first of all, having the right sizes and grades of tube and steel available, welding them together in the appropriate size configurations that put the right things in the right place, whether that be an eye mount on the bottom of the body or a fork mount, just to think of some of those other Japanese models, Hondas and Suzuki's typically having plenty of fork mount options on them from that era. So having that configuration set up correctly, at which point the shock absorber body itself will either move into being chrome plated or black powder coated. It'll go one way or the other at that point after the body has been assembled from those components. That's obviously largely a welding process, some machining with threads being cut into the body, because all of our shocks are rebuildable. So the thread is there as the nut that seals it, can be removed. Obviously, it needs to be put in the first place during assembly. And the eye ring itself on the bottom of the shock absorber has a machine surface inside of that incorporates a ridge inside that's part of the location approach for the bush. And that helps with laterality of the bush, which also causes the bush to get distorted on assembly, a normal part of the process. But its purpose ultimately is to help with lateral security of the bush, whereas a completely parallel eye isn't quite as stable from that point of view. So that takes place. Again, the next components are all of what goes into that. And there's a whole lot of processes used in that. Some of the components that we use are made using sintered technology. So they start off as powdered metal. They then get compressed in a mold and baked, of course, into their finished shapes.
Give me an example of a sintered part.
Okay, so the piston that's on the end of the shaft is sintered.
Okay.
There's a sintered part that you don't see in any of your shock absorbers because they're not part of the rebound adjustable series, but there's one in the top mounting eye that acts as part of the eye locating and securing mechanism that connects the top mounting eye to the shaft. That's another sintered part inside the shock absorber. The shaft itself, the shock absorber shaft, the piston rod as we call it, that has the valving on it. That is an induction hardened, hard chrome plated shaft of a particular grade, and the induction hardening and chrome plating done to a particular finish. That again is the same finish requirements and so on that have been used going back to the Coney days. The same standards apply, and we prefer not to discuss those sort of things publicly.
Now, I won't go into details of your proprietary processes, but are you doing a lot of this stuff in-house, or do you have local shops to work with? Okay,
it's a mixture. Yeah, just like the building of any vehicle, which is something that people out there would understand perhaps more readily. There's a whole range of things that we do in-house and out-house. For example, we don't wind any of the springs. We have those wound by professional spring manufacturers, typically in Australia or Europe. That's where the majority of those things take place, and the majority of that's actually taking place in Europe.
So leaving some of these very specialized processes to experts, much like we leave suspension design and manufacturing to you.
That's right. And some of this is historical relationships as well.
Yeah,
because this is exactly how the product was made by Coney. Coney would tell you straight away, we are shock absorber manufacturers, not spring manufacturers. Do we use springs? Do we help design work with? Absolutely we do, as does Ikon. No different. Dare I say, we've got decades of experience doing those things and love the process. and we will drive what are the materials requirements for those things for different part numbers, and that can vary, but it does have a very solid theme in the high tensile type high grade wires and for almost everything, because that's just the way you get a consistent spring result with long lasting performance. That's what you got to do. So that then, of course, is also finished in a black powder coat or a chrome plated finish. We don't do any of the chrome plating in-house. All of our chrome plating is done by professional chrome plating companies, and I'm glad that they do.
Yeah, exactly.
Powder coating, we do that in-house. So
simpler process.
yeah. But so there's a variety of things that take place. As I said, some in-house, some out of house, and that's very typical of manufacturing in the 20th, 21st century, just as you do yourselves, as you said.
Absolutely, yeah, very interesting. What can you tell us a little bit about? What are the different factors that are controlled by a shock absorber? So we talked. I've done some videos with people about like spring rate, damping, rebound, all these things. Just a brief, explanation of those for folks.
Okay, righto. So the suspension, because it's more than just a shock absorber. So it is the spring and the shock absorber typically in one assembly. So it's providing support for the vehicle, loaded and unloaded support, and it's providing whatever ride and handling outcomes it is responsible for. Obviously, things like tire choice, tire pressures, and things like that, they also come into play as well. But so first of all, the suspension is going to support any given mass. That's what it's going to do. It's going to hold it up. And ideally speaking, if we're trying to have a suspension that works, it's not going to hold it up to the point where when it's loaded, and the first load will at least be the rider, it's not sitting at its highest point, what we would call topped out. There's going to be some of what we call rider sag or load sag is going to be applied. So ideally speaking, we want to choose a spring setting, because at the moment everything's static, nothing's going anywhere. The shock absorber itself is not actually doing anything at this point particularly. There might be some spring effect for a shock absorber that's gas pressurized, but the shock absorber in its most elemental form is not doing anything other than helping support the spring that is now holding up the motorcycle. Right. It's only when the motorcycle starts to move that the shock absorber will start to do things. So at this point, we're trying to support it. And as you would know, the load variations are huge. All of us human beings come in different shapes and sizes. Some of us only ride on our own. Some people ride with themselves with a load. Some bikes have a sidecar on them, some don't, all this sort of stuff. All of that gets factored in when building something. This also is why it's actually, well, I will say it is impossible for a motorcycle manufacturer to cater for every possible rider and every possible riding circumstance. It just cannot be done.
Absolutely. It can barely do more than a few.
Exactly right. So, without wanting to be unkind to anybody, is the rider tall or short? Is the rider thin or fat? What are they? So there's all sorts of different things go along. So we've got to get this supported correctly and for the loads concerned. Obviously, the choice of the spring rate is going to have to start with some understanding of, if you're starting from scratch and you're building a motorcycle, what are the loads? How heavy is this thing? What is the suspension system that we're using? Now, okay, in the world of twin shocks, different to your 450, say, but in the world of twin shocks, some things get fairly simple insofar as the relationship for the majority of them is almost 1-to-1.
Right.
Yeah. So there's no movement
or maybe
ratio.
Some slight progression on.
Yeah, very, very, very little. You see on some bikes, again, to pick motorcycles that might be readily seen on US roads, perhaps some of the twin shock Dynas of the 90s and 2000s. Yeah, But okay, we take those, the shock absorber is moved along the swing arm. So it's a fair distance ahead of the axle.
Yeah.
That's adding a mechanical advantage from the wheel over the shock absorber. So that shock absorber is working much harder, say, than the shock absorber on a bagger or a Sportster, where the shock absorber was right back at the rear axle.
Right.
Or as it was on your Griffin model, for example.
Yep.
Okay. So there's differences in those. So all of that has to get factored in as well, because that is all a part of the support. So from an OEM point of view, you're going to have to simply make a choice somewhere down the line that says, okay, our so-called average rider profile and what we're going to set this up for is X.
Right.
In the aftermarket world, where we also play, which is the majority of our marketplace, of course, we're able to say, well, okay, there's not just Mr. X or Mrs. X, there's the entire alphabet of people.
Yep.
And how are we going to cater for all of those? So therefore, we will have choices, and we can spring things for people that are being sprung heavier for the heavier loads, lighter for the lighter loads, those sorts of things. Then it comes to damping. What's happening with damping? Compression and rebound. So compression damping is a fascinating beast. And this is where I like to talk about how shock absorbers and springs have a schizophrenic relationship. They're very friendly with one another on compression, because the compressive resistance of the shock absorber becomes the combination in motion of the hydraulic force that is offered through the compression valving of the shock absorber and the spring force.
Yep.
And so they're building up together as the shock absorber compresses. So what's the compression doing? Well, it's actually helping to smooth that compressive movement. That's especially important going over bumps. Otherwise, what you would find if there was absolutely no damping at all of a compression nature in the shock absorber, the wheel would tend to want to skip off the road, bounce off the road. Yeah. So the compression damping helps to keep that smoothly on the road. Helps then with the feel that the bike has in that way. As it goes over the bumps, you get a lot of the feel comes through the compression. Both in forks and in rear shocks or in leading links. You get a lot of feel from the compression and the spring rate. But then the roles change a bit. The spring says, this is fantastic. I've done some compressing. I've now got all this stored energy. I'm a spring. I want to go boing. And the shock absorber says, hang on a minute. No. We don't just go boing. So they're now no longer friends, they're enemies. The spring wants to be a spring, and the shock's saying, no, I'm going to restrain you. So that's what the rebound control does. So too little rebound control, and the spring, shall we say, having its head, and it just goes boing, bounces back up again. The suspension might top out. The rider gets a bit of a jolt, gets maybe thrown off the seat, going into the air, this sort of thing.
Yep.
And that's not a very good result. Of course, if you have too much rebound, if the shock absorber gets too much of its way over the spring, over a series of bumps, excessive rebound will jack the bike down.
Yep.
And see, so the rebound control has to arrive at a balance where the shock absorber allows the spring to release its energy, but doesn't do it in such a way that becomes uncomfortable, unsafe, all that sort of thing. It's got to remain right. Another thing, of course, that's going back into the spring choice and the loads and what have you, is preventing bottoming out. So this is where the preload adjustment on the spring comes in. And so adjusting the preload so as to make sure the load that's going on there is satisfactorily dealt with. That's why we focused on having 3 preload positions, and that again is historical, goes back all the way into the 1960s. And that comes from the basic idea that there are predominantly going to be 3 riding environments: solo, 2 up, gear, 2 up and gear. It could be solo and gear, solo 2 up, or solo 2 up and gear. So broadly speaking, across those environments, the 3 settings should allow you to cater for that if you've selected your spring appropriately. And we, again, because of the history, have got very much a focus on doing that using progressive rate springs. And they're typically a triple rate spring. There's some that are a dual rate, but mostly a triple rate spring to help achieve that purpose.
So what you're saying with preload is basically you're entering into the shock travel earlier. Is that a good way of?
Well, no, you're simply adding more. So in other words, if you've got we'll just keep it really simple for now. If you've got 100 pound per inch spring and you've got no preload on it at all, you put 100 pounds of load onto that spring, it will compress by 1 inch.
Yep.
That's why it's 100 pound per inch spring. If you were to preload that spring by 1 inch, put 100 pounds on it, it doesn't move. You've got to go past 100 pounds to get it to move, right? Because the preload is already said, I'm ready for you here. I'm hanging on. Give me that load. So the shocks have a preload on there. The spring on the shock has. And yes, because you've got the weight of the motorcycle going on and you've got the weight of the rider and others perhaps coming on as well. Right. And so therefore the spring setup is always this mixture of rate and preload. And so whenever you're tuning something, the two valid things to play with from a springing point of view are those two.
Yep.
What is your spring rate? Is it appropriate for the role? What is the amount of preload you've got? Is that appropriate for the role? Sometimes you'll change one and not the other. Sometimes you might have to change both. You might say, okay, right, we've got to have more spring rate and less preload. Or we've got to have, the other way around. Or you can have more of both. It all depends where you are and what you're doing.
Yep. Well, that's a pretty good description of the basic idea behind these shock absorbers. A lot of and in almost all cases, a motorcycle shock absorber would be what people call a coil over, because the damping and the spring is happening in one unit.
Correct.
Where on cars you could have a spring here and a shock absorber. So,
correct. That's right.
Or a damper.
Yes. Yeah, and this then is a uniqueness, I guess, to motorcycle suspension manufacturer, like the part of it that we do, insofar as you can make car shock absorbers, and typically you don't have to have anything to do with the supply of a spring at all. Whereas if you're going to be involved in the motorcycle suspension industry, you are going to be very heavily involved in springs as well as the shock absorber. And not only that, you're going to be very heavily involved in having an interest in the load that's going to go on that. Again, just to continue the comparison between the motor vehicle marketplace and the motorcycle marketplace. If you and I get inside a motor vehicle, our impact on the gross vehicle mass is negligible.
Yep.
On a motorcycle, even a fairly big one, say like a Triumph Rocket,
yep,
we can be quite a significant impact on the gross vehicle mass. And so therefore the suspension is much more heavily impacted by the rider than ever by a driver or passenger in a motor car.
And therefore its window of operation for different kinds of riders is narrower than a car. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, so that's why I'll maybe just be slightly extreme. I guess I should try and put this in pounds, not kilograms. I was going to say kilograms because that's what we're used to metric down here. So let's just say the 250 pound driver of a car versus the 125 pound driver of a car doesn't make much of a difference to the car.
Yep.
Makes a huge difference to a motorcycle.
Right.
And I would not dare spring the motorcycle the same for each of those two people. That would not be a clever move. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's a factor, generally accepted as being a safety thing, is that riders, when you stop riding and you come to a halt somewhere, you want to put your feet on the ground. And most likely, you're going to want to put your foot flat on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
For some riders, that's really easy.
Yep.
For some, it's not. So there's a valid need for some to lower the motorcycle so as to provide them with that slightly safer feel. That affects their riding confidence.
Right.
You see, we have two slogans within the Ikon suspension business. The first one, which is our corporate approach, which is bike on with
Bike on
Ikon.
with Ikon.
Right. So, and that's what we want people to do. We want them to be on their bikes, able to bike on, But the other thing that we also have as a cultural backdrop to every customer we work with is this idea that we do this because your ride matters.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is it's your ride. It's not mine. And it's not somebody else over there. This is yours. So what does that mean to you? That could mean I can't get my feet on the ground.
Right.
So I need to have it lower. Okay, good. So let's think about that. What does that mean? Okay. Yes, it means we can do that, but what happens when you lose that suspension travel, perhaps? Not appropriate for the Phoenix, perhaps, because it's not relevant. It's a rigid rear end.
Yeah.
But let's say we're lowering some motorcycle. So you're going to lose some suspension travel. So in other words, there's side effects to doing these things.
Yep. Ramifications for everything you do.
Exactly right. So, and because over the years, without wanting to be unkind to anybody, the number of conversations that we and our team have had where someone wants to lower their motorcycle and they think that that's an easy thing to do that has no other consequences.
Right.
But yes, it has a lot of consequences. And you're going to slow your steering down too, because you're pulling that steering head angle back towards you. You've changed your wheel alignment at the front there.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, did you want that? Well, your ground clearance, where's that gone? Oh, and by the way, look out for your side stand, because now your bike's going to be a little bit more vertical.
Vertical, yeah. Yep.
That's right. There'll come a point where it might just tip over. So let's think about what we're doing here. So these are the sorts of conversations you've got to have that all revolve around being able to make somebody able to ride their bike safely and enjoyably. And those two things come together. And so that's where that selection of spring rate, damping controls, ride heights, all that stuff gets individualized as much as possible. And we have, shall we call it, zones where we say, okay, so if you're, let's say, between 75, 95 or 100 kilos in our language, okay, we're mostly happy with you with our default setting, if you will. But if you move away from that, or you tell me, no, I only ever really ride solo, I'm just, I'm 80 kilos and I really have no interest in ever doing this, or this is now a single seat bike, it's the cafe racer type thing that's never going to see anybody else on the back of it, that becomes a different conversation.
Yep.
So really all that gets put into thought process.
Really, but you all are really involved in the tuning of these things for people's rides.
But in a very practical way. We don't try and be all things to all people. That would be unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
We know that suspension always is a compromise, but we do like what is the approach that we inherited from the history that we've been talking about earlier in our conversation. We like that approach. We've seen it work very practically for decades. And so on the basis if it ain't broke, don't fix it, we keep doing that. And until we find evidence that it isn't working, we will keep doing it, basically, because it just does work. It's proven itself time and time again. And on that genre of motorcycle, provides value and satisfaction that we believe is actually hard to beat in a Western world product.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly feel that way. Last question. I know we're getting close to our time limit here. We're a little over.
Yeah.
You mentioned what do you ride? I think you just mentioned it a little bit. What is your average rider and what's your history with bikes?
Okay, well, my history with bikes, as it goes back to childhood, which goes back to riding 50cc and 75cc mini bikes and those sorts of things. I still actually have in our possession a 50cc Gorelli that was what.
No kidding.
That
was my first bike.
As a business, we actually imported that and Guazzoni motorcycles from Italy in the 1972 to 74 type period of time. Yep. Another bit of history. So have that.
My first bike was a 1978 Gorelli.
Okay, well, there you 50. Go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because I think even in Canada, Bombardier made
Yeah,
some of those sort of bikes as
they did.
well.
Yep.
Yeah. In any case, but of more recent years, Honda 400 is where that is. But I'd have to confess, the amount of riding that I've done in the last couple of years is arguably negligible, um, which is annoying on one level, but totally driven by simply being so busy. And then one of the things we've had in Australia, certainly on the East Coast, for the last 12 months, is a quite not unprecedented. That's not historically true, but a huge amount of rain and flooding and things like this that have been going on. So
Yeah.
a whole lot of things haven't been happening across the last couple of years in a way that they might have otherwise done. So I guess as much as I have do enjoy riding myself, these days I'd have to say my focus is more on making sure other people are enjoying their riding, and that's what our team is focused on doing.
Well, a laudable cause.
Yeah, and that's also a good justification for allowing my daughter to continually thieve my 400cc motorcycle, Honda 400.
Well, great.
Yeah, Dad, you don't need it. No. Okay.
Well, wonderful. Well, I've learned quite a bit, and it's been good to kind of revisit just the whole process of I just realized, and to put it in perspective, that we've been working together for 7 years on our suspension. We're looking, we feature Ikon suspension on our new 450 as well. We did think about monoshock, like an actual monoshock lever suspension, but ended up going with a very traditional, as you mentioned, Geoff, kind of Vincent style design with a pair. Well, in our case, paired shock absorbers from Ikon. So we're excited about it. We're working on some more projects down the road to provide a little bit more adjustability for folks as an upgrade. Excited about that, and we look forward to many more years working with y'all, and hope to see you, Geoff, at some more events in the near future.
Well, that would be fantastic. But we'll see what the future holds.
We will.
It's interesting times, as some people like to say. But yeah, we enjoy that. We very much like the 450 product and the way you've put that together. I think it's an ideal nod to the past in terms of motorcycle engineering generally, and the way that works out. I think that's really nice. And yes, very Vincent styled in that way. I remember our discussions about that early on in the development process. That was really good. And I just think it helps the uniqueness of the Janus product out there in the marketplace to be something that's sort of historically relevant and modern at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, Geoff, thank you so much. Really, every time I do one of these, a new kind of lesson kind of comes out of each one of these conversations. And in this case, I think it's really just so much about manufacturing is relationships, and how valuable. And this is a classic example of that. One that certainly brings me a lot of joy. Any kind of correspondence or having this conversation. So I hope our owners, if you're watching this, or Ikon riders, this is the goal. So thank you so much, Geoff.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and all the best for Christmas and the New Year to you and the Janus team.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Take care. Enjoy your warm season.
Yeah, well, we're still looking forward to that. It's been ridiculously cold. Some people are even saying we're going to get snow for Christmas. We'll see. It has happened before, but we'll see.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised here. All right. Take care.
For you, we expect it. All right. Bye for now.